Okay, so Tailwind CSS. Today we're going to be talking about some of the pros to using Tailwind over normal CSS and just kind of the differences that it makes. So it's a utility first CSS framework. Basically what that means is it's rather than creating custom CSS styles for individual ID tags or class names, it will have pre-developed utilities that you can just inline apply to the element. So for example, down here we have a button called Click Me. Rather than having to make a class name and have a separate CSS file or like section of the page document, you can just directly apply it right then and there. And it just kind of streamlines the development for that. So some of the pros versus normal CSS, like we were talking about, in React especially, you can't have the CSS file with the JavaScript together. But you can have the Tailwind together with it. And with like other HTML CSS apps that's not using React, you can have the CSS together with it, but it gets kind of clumped up or hard to read just because there's so much on the one document. So it's pretty common practice to have the CSS file separate from the HTML and the JavaScript. And so rather than having to swap between all these different files, it makes it easier because you can just directly apply it to the element when you're making it. Another benefit is it eliminates naming conflicts particularly. So like I was saying, normally you would have to make a class name or like an ID or something like that for the specific element. And so when you're making the CSS, normally you have to make sure that it's linked up to the correct element. And it can get hard at times when you have 50 different classes or all these different buttons and elements, and making sure that it's all being applied to the correct thing. You have to make sure it's all spelled correctly. So rather than having to worry about that, you can just immediately apply it directly to that element. Also, because it has a lot of built-in supported utilities, things like dark mode and hover variations are a lot easier to implement. I'll show an example of that. So here we have a button. So it's going to say click me on the screen, and the class is custom button. So if you want to stylize that in normal CSS, you need to make the custom button chunk of CSS right here. But then if you want to do hover and dark mode, you have to have a whole separate one here for hover. And then you either have to have JavaScript to change the class name, or you need to do a media query to check the browser, and then have a whole separate chunk of it for dark mode and for hover. And so just for hover and dark mode alone for this custom button, you need to have 4 separate chunks of CSS written. And this is just a basic example, so it doesn't look that long. But in the future, if you're making like a very complex web app with a lot of cool stylization, it might get a lot longer. And so it can get hard to manage everything when if you have 12 buttons, you have to do it for each button. Or if it's all one class, right, you have to still worry about all the different components with it. Whereas with Tailwind, it's a lot easier. It's not eliminating having to look at all the different styles and different things to do, but rather than having to have 4 separate chunks of CSS, you can just do background white, text gray. And then for dark mode, they have it built in, so it'll automatically check the browser. And so all you need to do is just do dark : and it will automatically change the background there. And then like dark hover here. And rather than having to flip through files, make all these different chunks of CSS depending on the situational style, it is all just built right there into the button. And so it's super good, but some of the downsides, like we were saying, because it's all built into it, if you have a very heavily stylized class or element, the class name application can get a little bit long. And so if you're not super used to it, it can at times get a little bit confusing or maybe hard to read. But that's more so just like a learning curve, I'd say. If you have prior CSS experience especially, it might feel a little bit awkward just changing how you do it. But once you get used to it, though, it is pretty easy to implement it. And once you know the syntax, it's pretty easy to read it all. So, ultimately, I don't think it's necessarily replacing CSS, but it is a very good way of streamlining your styling development, and it speeds up the process for applying it. So rather than having to flip through all these different files, you can just directly apply it to the element you want to apply it to.